Live-action adaptations. Where do we even begin? Few topics ignite more debate among fans than the moment someone decides to take a beloved story, animated, drawn, or pixelated, and rebuild it with flesh and blood actors. Whether we're talking about remakes of classic animated films or attempts to translate video game worlds into tangible reality, live-action adaptations have always been, let's say, an adventure. And perhaps no corner of entertainment has a reputation for these ambitious experiments quite like anime and manga. To put it kindly, the history of live-action anime and manga adaptations is turbulent. Sure, some projects have been well-liked, or at least tolerated, but others are best left buried in the deepest corners of our collective memory. Yet across this wide spectrum of quality, there's a distinctive thread that ties all these adaptations together, an unmistakable sense of uncanniness. And honestly, it tracks. Anime and manga thrive on stylized worlds, larger-than-life characters, and an entirely different narrative structure. On the page or on the screen, these eccentricities feel natural because they are drawn. But once you translate them into the real world, even the smallest detail or gesture can suddenly look bizarre, artificial, or simply not right. Now, whether that uncanny quality is a sign of creative missteps or just proof that some stories simply aren't built for certain mediums is something that I'm not going to weigh in on. That's a topic for a whole other video. What I will say is that something always feels a little off, even in the best of circumstances. Typically, the adaptation pipeline is predictable. A manga becomes an anime, and then maybe someone greenlights a live-action version. But every now and then, the universe throws us a curveball and we skip a step entirely. Enter Naoki Urasawa, a man who genuinely needs no introduction. The mastermind behind Monster, Pluto, Billy Bat, and a whole lineage of manga that are basically required reading at this point. My favorite of his works is 20th Century Boys. It's nothing short of a masterpiece in my opinion, and it means a lot to me on a personal level. It's not just my favorite Urasawa manga, but my favorite manga in general, and one of my favorite stories ever told. But today, we aren't exactly diving into the manga itself. Oh no. We're here to talk about something very different. Something far stranger. Because yes, they made a live-action 20th Century Boys. Not one film, not two, an entire trilogy. While we're still sitting here with no anime adaptation, we somehow ended up with 3 massive live-action movies. The trilogy was directed by Yukihiko Tsutsumi, someone whose work I can't claim to know outside of these films, though his resume is huge. The project was announced in 2006 and released between 2008 and 2009, with a combined budget approaching 6 billion yen. That's around 2 billion yen per film, putting all 3 movies among the most expensive Japanese productions ever made. These were not small experimental passion projects, these were a colossal undertaking. From what I can gather, the reception is pretty mixed. Both fans and critics seem split. But how do I feel about them? Well, buckle up, grab your snacks, maybe get a drink, because I'm going to tackle that question by looking at each film individually. But first, a massive spoiler warning for the manga. In my opinion, 20th Century Boys is at its absolute best when you go in blind, and I'll be discussing many of its twists and great character moments. If you haven't read the manga, this is your warning and chance to click away. If you already know the story, or if you really just don't care about spoilers, then by all means, stick around. And just in case anyone here hasn't read the manga, but is still willing to push forward, or maybe it's been years and the details are a little fuzzy, I'm going to give a very quick refresher on what the story is actually about. If you want to skip this part, go to the timestamp on the screen. 20th Century Boys begins in the late 1990s and follows Kenji, a man living a pretty uneventful life managing a small family-run convenience store while helping raise his niece, Kana. Everything changes when he discovers a doomsday cult built around a mysterious symbol, one that he and his childhood friends created as kids back in the late 60s. The cult is led by a figure known only as Friend, someone who appears to have an intimate knowledge of Kenji's childhood. And as Kenji digs deeper, he learns that the group's plan for global domination is a recreation of a fantastical hero story he and his friends made up when they were young. Except now, the stakes are real, so Kenji and his old buddies reunite, not just to relive their childhood fantasies, but to actually become the heroes they once imagined, all before Friend's apocalyptic vision becomes reality.
誰が一家全員
The first film, 20th Century Boys: Beginning of the End, mainly adapts the first 49 chapters of the manga, though its ending does jump ahead to cover the flashback that occurs later around chapters 72 through 79. Right off the bat, I think the opening scene is excellent. It's essentially a shot-for-shot recreation of the manga's first few pages, but it also perfectly demonstrates one of the strengths of actually adapting this story to film. Actually hearing 20th Century Boy by T-Rex is an incredibly satisfying feeling, and I love the title card that uses footage of the World Expo and humanity's technological progress. It immediately establishes the tone and themes of the story in a really effective way. Unfortunately, I start to have issues almost immediately after this. The film jumps forward to Ocho in prison, speaking with the manga artist. This isn't inherently a bad decision, but I think it leans too hard into the idea of a foreboding future. Right away, we know that things are going to go terribly wrong. In the manga, the story opens with Kana seeing the robot and being terrified. That moment is still ominous, but it's vague in a way that doesn't yet let us fully grasp what's going to happen to these characters or to the world itself. It also helps that we don't even realize that the girl is Kana until chapter 50. By contrast, a viewer might recognize the man's voice in the opening scene as Ocho the moment he's properly introduced later on in the film. These kinds of changes don't alter the core story or events of the manga, but they do shift things around in ways that I find less interesting than the original presentation. The clearest example of this problem is how the mystery itself is framed and how the characters are introduced. In the manga, Kenji notices the reappearance of the symbol and the strange events happening around him, but he's too caught up in his day-to-day life to fully understand their significance. Meanwhile, we're shown Friend's plans slowly unfolding in the background, with his intentions remaining unknown until things reach a point of no return. In the film, the mystery and Friend's plot is pushed into the foreground. Kenji actively investigates what's happening, discovers information much faster, and treats the situation with a sense of urgency that wasn't present in the manga. The class reunion and Donkey's funeral are the most obvious examples of this shift. This approach also means that many of the scenes focused on Friend and his cult are completely absent. That's a real shame, because the moments we do get with Friend are actually pretty excellent. He still comes across as deeply unsettling, someone who seems to know everything while remaining an enigma himself. However, this more direct, less incidental version of Kenji discovering that his childhood memories are being weaponized makes the story feel far less engaging overall. Despite this, it's worth noting that most of the same major events still happen more or less as they do in the manga. There's a class reunion scene fairly early in the film, and while the scene does exist in the manga, its purpose is very different there. In the manga, it appears later and primarily serves to introduce Fukube. He starts out as a background character who only becomes truly important later, so establishing him early is crucial. In the movie, Fukube is technically introduced here, but so is nearly everyone else, aside from Yukichi and Ocho. He barely does anything. On top of that, the characters immediately start discussing the symbol, its connection to the cult, and the eerie idea that Friend is recreating Kenji's Book of Prophecy. I really dislike this choice. In the manga, the moment when Kenji and the reader realize that Friend's actions are recreations of a childhood hero's story is fantastic. And that scene still exists in the movie, so I don't really understand the need to so explicitly bring this idea up so early in the film. Additionally, Kenji's friends are far more invested in the mystery in the film. They openly discuss the strange events during scenes like Donkey's funeral. In the manga, most of them brush Kenji off and tell him he's overthinking things. Kenji knows something is wrong, but he can't fully grasp it on his own, and he struggles to piece together his memories. This makes Yukichi's introduction much more impactful. She's the first person who genuinely believes Kenji might be onto something. And even though she initially dismisses him, she comes back to help because she trusts him and still harbors some feelings from their childhood. Overall, the manga simply handles character dynamics and small interpersonal moments far better. That said, it's hard to completely blame the film for this. It has a massive amount of story to cover, and it needs to keep pushing the plot forward. On a more positive note, I really like how the childhood flashbacks are shot. They're bathed in warm lighting, and have a nostalgic, very comforting atmosphere that captures the feeling of the manga remarkably well. At times, the movie has a slightly odd, almost TV soap opera look to it, but in these simpler, quieter scenes, that style actually works in its favor. I also think the casting is spot on. Every character looks exactly how I imagined them from the manga. There was never a moment where I was confused about who someone was supposed to be. I mentioned Friend earlier, but it's worth repeating how strong his depiction is. I just wish he had more screen time. Some of the set pieces are also very well done. The Friend concert stands out as a particularly strong adaptation, and the giant robot rampaging through Tokyo on New Year's Eve carries the same overwhelming, ominous presence it had in the manga. Soundtrack is surprisingly effective as well, with Friend's theme being the clear standout. There's an uncanny quality to it, using instruments that typically sound innocent, which works perfectly to portray him as a symbol of corrupted youth. The last thing I want to focus on is the ending. The film's climax is the bloody New Year's Eve, adapted almost directly from the manga's flashback. For the most part, I think this sequence is actually really cool. My main issue is whether it belongs here at all. I understand why it was included, provides a big, exciting climax to the end of the movie, but I think it loses some of the impact the manga had. In the manga, chapter 50 suddenly jumps forward 14 years, right as Kenji and his friends are about to confront the robot. It's a shocking and rather bold move that turns the bloody New Year's Eve into a looming mystery for quite a while. When the story finally jumps back and shows how Friend emerged victorious, it's incredibly satisfying. I honestly think ending the movie at chapter 49 and opening the sequel at chapter 50 could have made for a fantastic cliffhanger. That said, I understand this might have made the second film, which already has the most ground to cover, even more bloated. What I definitely don't agree with though, is ending the film by explicitly revealing Kana as the new hero. I think it would have been far more effective to end on the confrontation between Kenji and Friend. Then, at the start of the next film, introduce Kana, especially if the Bloody New Year's Eve absolutely had to be included here. In my perfect world, the movie would end on the cliffhanger at chapter 49, but I understand why that wasn't done. Overall, I think this film is a solid, if flawed, start to the trilogy. It's largely faithful to the manga and doesn't make any drastic changes to the story. It's just a less effective and less engaging version of it. Still, there's clear promise here. As the first entry in a trilogy, it works well enough. Friend remains just as eerie and compelling as you'd want him to be. Kenji is still a likable protagonist. Archo is still a badass whenever he's on screen. It's simply missing that extra touch that made the source material so special.
大きな声で曲がれって言ってください。曲がれ!
The second film, 20th Century Boys: The Last Hope, makes far more changes and rearranges a lot more material to fit its runtime. It still follows the same general approach as the first film, trying not to significantly alter the core story, but the changes here are far more drastic. I can't realistically go over all of them without this video becoming endless, so I'll focus on the ones I think are most worth talking about. This movie covers a much larger portion of the manga, almost double the amount of content that the first film adapted. The result is a movie that feels far more bloated and one that drags its feet much more than its predecessor. Much like the first film, many of the more interpersonal scenes are cut for the sake of the runtime and keeping the plot moving, and I think Kana's character really suffers because of it. Kana is a character I came to love through the smaller moments, the brief interactions she has with people like Chuno and Yukiji. When those moments are removed or made less significant, she comes across as less of a fully realized character and more as a vehicle for the audience to experience the story through. She loses a lot of her likability and simply isn't as interesting. This also weakens the emotional impact of several scenes involving her in this film and the next one, moments that felt genuinely poignant in the manga. Kana isn't the only character affected by this though. Sadakio suffers even more. For starters, his nature and intentions are revealed far too quickly for my liking. In the manga, he's unsettling for a while before it's revealed that he's really just a misunderstood and lonely person. The movie speeds through his character arc because it doesn't directly advance the plot beyond him giving the characters the memo. What I really can't stand though, is the removal of his entire backstory and especially the scene where Sadakio reunites with his childhood teacher. That page where he's given a photograph of himself as a child is one of the most powerful moments in the entire story. That moment humanized Sadakio and strongly reinforced the story's themes about memory, loneliness, and isolation. It also is just worth noting that he doesn't show up at all for the rest of this adaptation, so I hope you liked what you got. It's about like 10 minutes of screen time. There are also some major changes to Friend's character that make more sense in the context of the third film, but I still don't like them. The incredible scene between Ocho, Yamane, and Friend in the science room is gone. Well, it technically still exists, but Friend doesn't appear and have an awesome monologue, and Yamane doesn't shoot him there. I always thought it was incredibly fitting and symbolic that Friend's death occurred in the same room where Fukube once tried to stage a fake death and resurrection as a child. Friend is still shot later on, but it happens in a completely different context and setting. He's in like a car doing a pilgrimage thing. This also means Friend's identity isn't revealed yet. The filmmakers likely wanted to save that for the third movie, but I don't fully agree with that decision. Friend's identity is far more complicated than just being one person, and the manga spends a lot of time exploring that through his backstory. Who Friend is raises even more compelling questions. Why and how? In the manga, Ocho unmasks Friend after he's shot in the science room and discovers that it's Fukube. Then there's a large portion of the story where the characters believe Friend is dead, while we, the audience, see that he's somehow still alive and orchestrating a massive resurrection witnessed by the entire world. That section still exists in the movie, save for the reveal of his identity. Friend is thought to be dead, and he still performs the resurrection at the World Expo, but it's drastically shortened. It's maybe 10 to 15 minutes in the film, whereas in the manga, it spans a significant stretch of chapters. It's an interesting mystery trying to figure out what is going on with Friend. We want to learn more about who he is, and we also want to try to figure out how he's alive. So hanging on to that mystery for a long time really made the manga an engaging read. The resurrection itself is also handled very differently. In the movie, the Pope isn't in danger, and he isn't even present. The entire plot to assassinate the Pope is absent from the movie and goes nowhere, despite being a huge part of the manga. So Friend doesn't save him or get shot when he returns to life. It's almost unintentionally funny, because the film still recreates that iconic manga panel of Friend pointing toward the sky while kneeling, but here he's not injured at all, so he just kind of drops to his knees for no real reason. In the manga, he's wounded and physically unable to stand fully, so the pose makes sense. On a more positive note, I once again have to praise the casting. All of the newly introduced characters look remarkably close to their manga counterparts. Friend, despite the changes, is still imposing and threatening. I want to give special recognition to Koizumi. She's a really fun character in the manga, and that energy carries over here. Her exaggerated expressions and mannerisms are great, and she's brought to life in a way that makes her just as entertaining and funny as she was on the page. She provides a very welcome perspective of someone who unintentionally gets wrapped up in the story and just wants nothing to do with it. There are also strong set pieces, much like in the first film. The standout is easily Friendland. It's as megalomaniacal as you'd hope, and I love how the movie approached the virtual game. It's really funny. I also really appreciate the inclusion of Kana exploring the abandoned hospital and watching her mother's message in the movie theater. That's honestly one of my favorite scenes in the manga. It always really stuck out to me, so I'm really glad that scene made it into the film. Despite how hard I'd been on it, I do still really like the resurrection scene overall. The moment retains that overwhelming sense of dread and portrays Friend as an inhuman, unstoppable, godlike presence. Hearing the cheers of the crowd layered over that foreboding soundtrack elevates it even further. Speaking of sound, I also have to mention the use of Bob Lennon, a song that Kenji writes. It's wonderful. Actually, hearing him perform it is immersive in a way that only an adaptation with audio can be. It's one of those scenes that reminds me why I'm grateful this story was adapted at all. Overall, I think this movie is much weaker than the first. It had too much ground to cover and constantly teeters between changing too much and trying to remain as faithful as possible. The pendulum swings too far from scene to scene, and as a result, the film feels bloated, cramming in as much content from the source material as it can, but not always in a way that feels fully satisfying. This part of the manga had a lot of different plot threads with different groups of characters doing different things before it all intersects. But the film can't take this approach, and it results in things just happening while skipping over scenes that were vital for context and characterization. The third film, 20th Century Boys: Redemption, is interesting. This film attempts to adapt everything from Friend's resurrection all the way through the 21st Century Boys epilogue, which is already an impossible task on its own. As a result, the movie mostly just meanders, occasionally stopping to recreate a random scene from the manga. The pendulum I mentioned earlier swings even more drastically here. One moment it's inventing entirely new material, and the next it's awkwardly recreating iconic manga scenes with no proper build-up. There's also a strange and completely nonsensical subplot about Yoshitsune being Friend, which goes absolutely nowhere and feels like nothing but wasted time. But maybe that's just because I read the manga first. If there's anybody out there who experienced these movies before they read the manga, I'm really curious to know if the whole Yoshitsune thing was effective. As a manga reader, it really just comes off as uninteresting. The film keeps the scenes involving the nameless assassin, but replaces him with Manjome, who is almost unrecognizable compared to his manga counterpart. Though I will say, his death scene is unintentionally hilarious. Overall, the movie has far too much to wrap up while still insisting on adapting key moments from the manga. I genuinely think all three films would have benefited from committing to one direction. Either be incredibly faithful and accept the pacing issues that come with it, or completely go off the rails and do their own thing. Instead, the trilogy constantly tries to do both and just hope it works, and more often than not, it really doesn't. The biggest issue though is obviously Friend. In the manga, there are essentially two different ways to interpret this character depending on which version you read. In the original release, Fukube is Friend until he's killed in the science room, after which Katsumata takes his place. In the complete edition, Fukube was only Friend during childhood. He dies, and Katsumata assumes his role and entire identity, acting out Fukube's ambitions while essentially assimilating who he was. Though it is worth noting, Naoki Urasawa claimed years later that this was always his intention, so take that for what you will. Regardless of which version you prefer, or if you think there was ever a difference and one ending was just more clear, that debate isn't really what this video is about, and I'm not going to weigh in on that. I'm going to be comparing the films specifically to the complete edition, since the movies clearly operate under the idea that Katsumata was Friend the entire time. To the film's credit, there is a more conscious effort to make Katsumata's ambitions feel relevant, as well as to make him a more sympathetic character. The space badge is brought up multiple times, and it has a much stronger presence than it does in the manga. And I think you could argue, though I don't fully agree, that the final reveal is handled a bit better than it was in the manga, where it feels sudden and really only clicks on a reread in my opinion. The big problem here is that Fukube is effectively erased from the story. Sure, the characters mistakenly call Katsumata Fukube, and they refer back to when he was introduced in the first film, but his actual character is reduced to a random childhood bully and nothing more. The film tries to compensate for this by merging elements of Fukube's backstory into Katsumata's, but this doesn't work at all. It just makes Katsumata more confusing and contradictory, and they don't even fully commit to it, since large chunks of that backstory are still cut, which is a real shame because in my opinion, that's some of the most compelling content in the manga. In the film, Katsumata is portrayed as someone who's seemingly against bullying, yet his backstory has him bullying Sadakio, something that should have been Fukube. You can't just transfer Fukube's actions onto Katsumata, because their ambitions are fundamentally different. Everything Fukube did, the science room, the haunted house, the bullying, the expo, even imitating Kenji's prophecy book, was driven by his desperate need for attention. He was an attention-starved, self-absorbed, pathological liar who exploited and trampled over lonely people for his own gain. His inability to receive the recognition he craved and thought he deserved led him to see himself as a faceless entity, to the point where he didn't even want to be called by his own name. That's where the identity of Friend comes from. In my opinion, Katsumata in the manga can be seen similar to how one may see Yamane or Sadakio. He's another victim of Fukube's bullying. Fukube declares him dead, invalidating his existence, and Katsumata spends the rest of his life imitating the only person he ever knew or understood as a friend, Fukube, even going as far as to model his appearance after him. When he stages Fukube's death in the science room, Katsumata is able to resurrect himself, but only as the person he was when his life effectively ended, a forgotten child consumed by a grudge. That's why I like Friend. He's an amalgamation of multiple people's ambitions and identities. He becomes more of an idea and a symbol than the will of any single child or man. It's also why I love that we never see Katsamata's face as a child in the manga. He remains a faceless presence, known only by a name, to us and to the characters. It can be argued that despite the fact that Fukube died, Katsamata became more like Fukube than whatever was left of himself. In the film, though, Katsamata becomes this awkward, jumbled character, stitched together from Fukube's backstory. Why does he fake hanging himself in the science room? Why does he bully Sadakio? Why does he call himself friend at all? These things make perfect sense for Fukube, but the film never suggests that Katsamata has the same desire for attention, or imitated Fukube, so these actions feel completely bizarre and unexplained. If the filmmakers were going to basically remove Fukube entirely, then his backstory should have just gone with him, not been awkwardly stapled onto a different character. Fukube is vital to understanding Katsamata, but that doesn't mean they're the same character. They are two characters that have intersecting stories that help understand who Friend is and where he came from. What makes this even stranger is that the movie still includes a fake-out friend. It's just Yoshitsune instead, and at the same time, they clearly believed that certain elements of Fukube's backstory were too important to cut, which I agree with. So the obvious question becomes, why not just keep Fukube as he was in the manga and make him the fake-out? What is actually gained by changing this? All it does is make Katsamata's character more confusing. That said, I'll admit this, I think the movie actually sticks the landing. I don't agree with showing Katsamata's face, but besides that, the final 10 minutes, especially Kenji apologizing to him, are genuinely effective. The film slows down, lets the moment breathe, and builds a proper emotional payoff. As a matter of fact, I also really like the concert scene that comes before it. The entire ending of the movie, it's actually quite good. This movie does many of the same things that the previous films did right, and it falls into all the same traps. When it's simply adapting manga scenes, it can be quite good. I also think some of the expansions are very nice, like elaborating where Kenji had been, going into a little more depth about how he felt about his memories and running away from his past. And at times, it's unintentionally really funny, but it still has that strange, uncanny TV soap opera look, and the changes it makes are baffling. The end result is a story that's inferior to the source material in every way. Scenes that were deeply emotional in the manga, like Kana and Yukiji confronting each other in the church, lose their impact. Other moments feel forced, as if the film is checking off required manga scenes without understanding why they worked. A perfect example of this is when Kana tries to kill Friend. In the manga, there's an incredible page where Friend calls himself a 20th century boy, right before the elevator doors shut. In the movie, that moment just feels awkward and random. He just kind of says it, and then Kana awkwardly walks away. Ultimately, these films end up feeling like a collection of moments. Some well adapted, others completely botched. Redemption was stuck in the hardest position, trying to wrap up everything while still adapting the manga, which was always going to be impossible. It had to deal with its predecessor's faults while also dealing with new challenges. What you get is a movie that somehow manages to land its final scene, but only by letting every other plane crash and burn. It's messy, strange, and just as conflicted as the films that came before it. This whole trilogy is interesting. From a technical perspective, it's mostly fine. I think most of the performances are good, and the oddities probably have more to do with the script. I once again point to Kyoko Koizumi, probably my favorite performance out of the trilogy. The CGI and effects are fine for Japanese productions made in the late 2000s, and the love for the material is clearly there with the costume and set designs. But I just can't get over how odd it all looks. I wish I could properly describe it.
じゃあねバイ
And that's the trilogy as a whole. If I had to sum up all three films in a single statement, it would be this. They're messy, somehow incredibly faithful, and completely unfaithful at the same time. Each film drifts progressively farther from the source material, and watching that transformation unfold is in its own way fascinating. Despite my constant criticisms, and despite the fact that I probably sound like a manga purist who dislikes anything that dares to be different, I don't actually dislike these movies. At the end of the day, this is still 20th Century Boys. Even in this warped, strange, and often compromised form, the story still carries weight for me. The manga's unfathomable heart still shines through, and it still manages to move me. It's one of those stories I simply can't shake. It lingers, even when it's filtered through something as unorthodox as 3 2.5-hour live-action films. Beneath all of the issues, this is still a story about memory, about the lasting impact of your childhood, about the immovable bonds we form over the course of our lives, about how small actions can affect people in big ways. That core remains untouched. It's the same beautiful story I fell in love with, and maybe this is my bias speaking, but I just can't bring myself to hate these movies. Even when they stumble, even when they fail, both technically and as adaptations. Every time I see a manga panel that's recreated, it just makes me smile. So can I recommend them? That's a much harder question. There's certainly no replacement for the manga, and if you've never experienced 20th Century Boys before, I can't, in good faith, tell you to start with the films. If you're already a fan, someone who loves the story despite, or maybe even because of its flaws, you might find them interesting in the same way I did, but they're far from essential viewing. And I think that speaks to a larger issue, not just with these films, but with live-action manga and anime adaptations in general. Who are they really for? Are they for superfans who will nitpick every small change, like me? For newcomers who have no attachment to the original? Or for people with a passing curiosity who just want to see if it's good? I honestly don't know if the answer is one of those or all of them at once. Live-action adaptations exist in this strange, liminal space. Successful or not, good or bad, you always hear the same refrains. Just read the manga, or it's better if you've already seen the original. I mean, I just said it myself. They exist in a kind of perpetual purgatory, something that simply exists, and maybe that's exactly what makes them so fascinating. It's a tall wall to climb, and some people would rather not attempt it at all. If it worked as a manga or an anime, why change it? Why risk diluting something special? But at the same time, I can't fault people for wanting to see the stories they love brought to life, or for wanting more of them, even when the results are imperfect or disappointing. Movies like these will keep being made, and maybe the real question isn't whether they succeed or fail, or who are they for, but what it says about how deeply we want to hold on to the stories that matter to us, and how far we're willing to follow them, even when they come back to us in a different, imperfect shape.